All right, so welcome to this open program for this year. So we're starting today the RCR Summer Workshop. This is the 16th edition. And here we have with us participants coming from all over the world. And now we're going to start a second part, a part that we share with the city of Olot. This is the open program. And this year, this is devoted to the topic of air. In spite of its invisible nature, air has always played a major role in architecture and in urban development because health and physical and mental well-being depend on the quality of the environment. And such a wide concept as the air brings us the opportunity to create the intersection for any discipline in the air. And actually, architecture plays a major role in this invisibility because architecture creates spaces and creates boundaries for it. So the lab is working right now in the European project called Air for European Resilience. And this is a project that places technology for the first time. It places technology at the hands of two different computing centers in Stuttgart and Barcelona. So the AIR initiative is a European initiative in order to foster initiatives merging science and art and bringing a European innovative approach focused on the needs and human values so that we can face the challenges that we have ahead, economic challenges, ecological challenges, by bringing value to the role of art, industry, and vice versa. So this project underlines the importance of including cultural industries, creative industries, so that we can increase competitiveness in Europe and so that we can foster innovation. Now, we've just seen a video which is entitled Nothing Else, Nothing Less. It's a video by Javi Munoz. It's a video that tells us a story of art, passion, and perseverance. And it's been recorded in Espacio Babri, which is one of the iconic spaces created by RCR architects. Jamal Calendar is a great choreographer and dancer from the Juliet Dance School, and he's the person you'll see at this artistic production. And Javi, who's the director of the video, wants to underline the role of homosexuality and racism and how these topics are very much presented very often, unfortunately, as barriers in the world of art and dance. Jamal shows in this video his strength and perseverance in front of all the negative attitude that surrounds the world. And all these barriers are overcome and they become energy and passion. And that's how he became one of the best professionals in his field. So this is quite inspirational for all of us. And now we're going to start a lecture, a conference with Francis Solé, who's here sitting next to me. And the title is Architecture in All Its States: How to Make Architecture Possible in an Impossible World. So he's going to tell us about architecture in an impossible context. We will see all his projects. And Francis Solé is a graduate at the School of Architecture in Paris-Villemin. He's a member of the Order of Architects since 1975. Then in 85, he created Francis Solé Architect, and he set a company, Architecture Francis Solé, that he directs. And the National Congress Center in Paris was a leading project and the pioneering project in a series of projects merging spaces for architecture and art. His works uh, include a necessary economy, but also many more factors from abstraction to more concretion. And actually, all his projects are conceived as a unique masterpiece that plays an essential role in the city. His research is very broad, and his projects are also very broad. It includes housing, tertiary facilities, cultural projects like the Museum of Quai Branly and the Visconti Room of Musée du Louvre, the Philharmonic of Paris, and many other projects in urban areas. And his office has also participated in many different contests of architecture for public projects and public tenders. And his work and designs have been subject to many different conferences around the world, and they have been published in the international press, in IMC, Intramuros, Archinews, Beaux-Arts, Archiplus, Bovel, and Arquitectura Viva. And he was awarded with the Great National Prize of Architecture in 1999, and he is also the Knight of the Légion d'honneur since 2007. And now, after having introduced him, we're going to give the floor to Francis Solé. Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you for being here this evening, and thank you to Carmen, Rafael, Ramon. Thank you for having invited me. And well, thank you for letting me show some of my projects. So as the title says, these projects have encountered difficulties. It was difficult to execute them in this impossible world that we have ahead. So I'm going to talk about some projects. And as we were hearing, architecture has become like a combat sport, and you have to be very resistant to lead projects like RCR is doing. I do admire these 3 people in RCR because they're a fantastic team, and I have visited some of the projects that they are executing, and certain projects are like in a kind of permanent struggle, and this is important today because some of the projects involve a complete merger between the container and the content. So there's I also had the opportunity to sleep in Las Cols. And actually, if you were not able to do that in the past, I do recommend you that you go there and have a stay, because this is a kind of experience that brings you to a parallel world somewhere in the cosmos. So it's magnificent, it's wonderful. So well, after having expressed my gratitude for being here, I would like to show some of my projects. And I know that it's very complicated to talk about my architecture. Now, the idea, what I'm trying to develop for certain years already, is that, well, in order to design a piece of work by an architect, well, you do not always have to do the same thing. You can think about different topics and different subjects, and you can try to find different languages for each project. But in spite of all this, you can build up a coherent piece of work. And the proof of this is this Garden of Delight by Miramboge. And this is like a global masterpiece, which means actually that you can do varied things. And you can see this here in the picture, but at the same time, each piece of work will contribute to a global piece of work. So there's a coherence in the different layers of this work. And of course, you cannot dissociate one piece of work from the other, even though they're not the same. Now I'm going to tell you about quite a recent project for EDF, which is the electricity company in France. We finished in 2016 after 3 years of works and many years dedicated to the project. And this was, in spite of all, it was quite fast because we had a very smart team. So we could really progress a lot in this project. And this is a building which is the research center in the Plateau de Saclay, where all the scientists and all the major university and technical schools are there. So this is a space with 4 buildings in the shape of circles. The largest one has a diameter of 167 meters, and the others are 70 to 80 meters. And actually, we're talking about air and space. And here I'm talking about circular buildings because as an architect, I want to work based on landscape. So I want to give to people something that is not too massive. And here we have 2,000 people living in this center. So the idea of having these circles, kind of overlapping allows for some perspectives that will allow for this project to wander around. I mean, you can wander along the building. Now you can see the plane here. This is from another project, actually. It's an important project. You can see that, if you're traveling by plane and you're landing in the airport of Orly, you will see this. And this is actually, we were in an architecture where everything was square and regulated. And now, with all these circles, we're breaking that regularization. So this is some kind of way out. And as you can see here, we have elements. We have a functional space at the center, and then we have windows that allow us to harness the wind currents and the light. And there's always some movement. I mean, it's something that you can change and shape depending on the angle of the sun. I mean, there's never the same perception. The building is not static, or let me say that the building is indeed static, but you can change the way you look at it because you can really place those windows the way you want. And here, this is the major building for research where all nuclear calculations are made. And then there's also this room that you can see here where the work is done. And what's interesting here is that, well, we could experience the Dalactive system coming from Germany. Since we had a great amount of offices to build, we wanted to have a very flexible building. People working for EDF, for this electricity company, they change their structure and department every 2 or 3 months. So we wanted a very large space with no pillars in between, and we wanted the heating to be able to come from all these tiles. So the tiles will allow this heating and refrigeration to take place. So you can see actually that between these two surfaces there's no pillar and no passage of fluid because all the fluids are circulating through the facade. So you can see the result. So these are offices. So in the same space, you can really execute different programs. And this is the ground level. Well, this is, sorry, the lobby, the reception. And the particularity of this project is that this cross-shaped structure is able to hold a vacuum. It was difficult to make engineers understand this, but actually here we have a structure that is going down, and it has this beam actually that allows for this to hold. And this is a kind of auditorium for 500 people. It's to host conferences. And this is the most secret place in the building. This is all the experimental research, everything that is studied is developed here at this space. So the person that you can see here on the left is a photographer. He's a friend of mine, and he's just like Jacques Tati. He just takes pictures of himself. He does not take pictures of the building, but rather himself. And this is something that I asked him to do. Some other spaces. And as you can see, every time we're working on the scale, and every time we're bringing a smaller scale, and this will allow people to get closer to each other actually, and to meet and to have a chat and everything. And again, let me tell you about the topic of ventilation, the air circulating, and elements are in a kind of friction, and we never have the idea of this massive building. We don't have the impression that this is so large. And the outside spaces were actually made by Pascal Crébier. These are wonderful spaces. Unfortunately, the designer passed away. And again, the photographer wandering around the building, he said, well, since the architecture is in all its states, I'm going to put myself in all my states. So well, within this diversity, I wanted to show you my work, the project for EDF, the electricity building. But now I'm going to show you some examples of social housing, which is which is my passion, actually. This is part of my mission. I always think that we cannot always execute palaces or buildings devoted for grand purposes. I think actually that one of the responsibilities of architects is to provide social housing. So here we have an example in a very classy neighborhood in Paris, and we foresaw 400 houses for social housing purposes. And then two other operations by Aldemiange and Fing Geipel from Berlin. And they both actually made very interesting projects. And this is the plan. And this is a series of buildings, and they're just sitting there in a plot of land with two new buildings from Ricciotti and Nelia. And in the middle, we have the building by Anne Demian, and then the other building is by Finn Geipel. So now we can increase the line of the facade with this building. And actually, from an ecological point of view, this is a kind of passive building. I mean, you don't need to instrumentalize the building so that they can become more ecological. I mean, you don't need some photovoltaic cells in order to become more ecological. I mean, just the layout of the building is going to provide this ecological touch. Bearing in mind, of course, the orientation, and also bearing in mind the climate in Paris, which is not the same as here, of course. So here we have an example of the building, and what's interesting here in this operation is that we could achieve a system where the matter is worked in a different way. We are talking about 400 houses, and we are using for all of them the same systems for woodwork, same system of matter. I mean, the matter is used in a way that you can streamline all the purchases of all this matter, and you can streamline it, and you can provide the same amount of quality in all the matter that you're using for this social housing as if it was for non-social housing. So you're keeping the same quality level. And actually, well, here we are creating an airflow. And again, I'm talking about social housing. This is social housing. So certain people, well, they just make their request and they become candidates for this social housing and they get it. So we have this facade and it kind of opens like an accordion. And then we have these balconies. So this system is generalized in the entire project, in the 4 buildings that we've seen. It's the same system for the balconies. And some quick images about the project. This is the lobby in the building from Andemion and Fingepel. Also Tour Eiffel right behind. We have the perspective of the Porte d'Auteuil and the Tour Eiffel. And we're inside the building from by Anne Demion. We have this kind of space, of empty space with no ceiling. And there's this kind of artistic space that is created. It's a kind of endless space, like an abyss. So when you enter here, I mean, there's no notion of space. You don't know where you are. And this is the alignment of 3 buildings out of the 4. So you can see here, again, the homogeneity. And well, architects, they all have their own sensitiveness, but they are obliged to follow certain rules. And of course, well, this can only be achieved because we know each other very well. I mean, we've been colleagues for many years, like for 30 years with some of them, 20 years. So we trust each other, because let me tell you that sometimes in certain tenders in Paris, some architects, a handful of architects are placed together, and they're obliged to work together, and they don't know each other, and then it doesn't work. Whereas here we mutualized architecture. It was collective work. Am I hearing some birds here? Is it birds that I'm hearing? Yes, I think they're just watching us. So one of the first buildings, we made one of the first communist buildings in social architecture. So this operation was exhibited in the Cité de l'Architecture in Paris. And well, this was the object of an exhibition for many years, for many months. Now let's move to a different project, another project that we won, and this one is for South Korea, Seoul. This was the result of a tender that the city of Seoul launched. There was a first group of contest that was launched in the city of Seoul, and it was called Underground, and then a second phase which was called Upper Ground. So this was the awarded project, with 2 other projects, an Italian one, Maximiliano Fossas, and a Spanish one, Eduardo Arroyo, who's a very good friend of mine from Madrid. So in this case, we're talking about a project that takes place in the river of Seoul. And along the river, there was a very large highway with a lot of pollution, actually, and also with a lot of disrupting elements. You can see the highway there along the the river, and this neighborhood, it's the shoemakers neighborhood, and the city wanted to displace all of this to build some richer and wealthier buildings. Well, we decided to allow for the shoemakers to stay in their neighborhood, but also to build those buildings. And actually, it was something, it was a huge project, a little bit like when the boa swallows the elephant from Saint-Exupéry. So it was a little bit like trying to allow something to stay and digest that thing. So what we had to do is to let the highway remain, and then we had to work underwater in order to create certain elements. So we created a kind of parallel island, and this is the water that you can see. I'm hearing the birds. So here's the water that comes, and the water is flowing until the quays in the city of Seoul, the docks there. So there was some kind of diversion of the system. The water was flowing above us instead of under us. So it was this kind of water surface. And well, we're just waiting for this project to be executed, because of course, as any project so far away, it takes some time, it's slow, and well, we're just in communication. And the project ends with a tower 200 meters high. And this tower is a kind of sign for the landscape in Seoul, because in this area of Seoul, the landscape is very flat. And this is another project in La Défense in Paris with a system for hotels and offices. And we were asked to work here next to the Arc de la Défense. And well, they asked for us to work horizontally, but we decided also to overlap certain things and work vertically. And well, we wanted to be very technical, very safe. Of course, if you're building a tower, you have to think of many different things. And we have this kind of twin towers, which are like two dancers, and they're entangled. So this is what we get. This is just next of the arena, which is a rugby stadium. Another French architect. And these are the interior spaces next to the Arc de la Défense. And now here, this is quite a critical system. Here I'm going to show you two different projects that show to what extent it is difficult to make some propositions when you're an architect and nobody wants to listen to you, but maybe 30 years later, what you were saying was worth being listened. So this is a project in New Caledonia, which is a French territory next to Australia. So we can see here in the layout, we were asked to build a university campus with the classrooms and universities and everything. And this plot of land was inclined, it was in the slope. So the idea was to use the natural terrain, and the idea was to extrude the terrain so that we could build some inhabited fibers. This is what you can see here in the layout. And so this would be some kind of metal structure that we would use from the technology in New Caledonia, which was about trying to truss and entangle fibers of bamboo. So these are bamboo fibers, and each fiber has a certain characteristic. Every fiber is inhabited by, every row is inhabited by this kind of houses and with windows, and these are inclusions. And this is what we call in French flamboyant, flamboyant. And this was just to, you change the fiber, you change the flower. So after positioning all this, you can build up a program. So this is from 1994. I'm talking about 30 years ago. And the commissioner of the French Republic, well, he said, go back home. We don't want this here. So, sometimes sometimes you are in a project and it's too early in the line of time. If we were talking right now about this kind of project, 30 years later, it's ecological. But maybe at the time it was too early. We were working with airflow, with a certain climate, with something that was endemic. And the commissioner of the government in New Caledonia, he said, well, we just want a university, just a standard university building, like the ones you have in Paris. We don't want this. We don't want this kind of structure in Nouméa, in spite of the fact that it's 45 degrees Celsius in the summer. So anyway, another project. This time, this is in Lorient, in the west coast, the French coast of the west in the Atlantic, and it's the windiest place in Europe. So we were asked here to renovate the bunkers that were used by the German troops during the Second World War to restore submarines. So we're talking about bunkers with walls which are 5 meters wide. So I just thought, well, let's try to use energy and work on the technology of energy. So this is 1999, and we propose to clean the terrain, the surface, and to place a wind farm. So this is sustainable development, and this allows us to produce energy, enough energy to provide half the energy needed by the city of Lorient. And actually we were discarded. We were discarded because of this. And surprise, in 2012, there's the same project coming up. So again, I'm talking here about 24 years which have been necessary to understand that the city of Lorient is the windiest city in France, and you can use this at your advantage and place a wind farm. So again, architecture is possible in an impossible world, and in this impossible world you have to struggle and to fight, to become listened to. And now again, I'm going to show you another building which was quite iconic, because in 1997 I was already proposing to build social housing. And the idea was here to have social housing in all terms. I mean, with the perception that you have of the house from outside and also from inside. Very often social housing is a little bit poorer, but here we have a structure made of pillars and tiles. And let me say that this is very much the kind of building that you can find in Costa Brava, the buildings that were built in the 70s. And this is serigraphy. And this is a topic actually that I'm using. This is art that I'm using for the social housing. And actually this is a piece of work. And here I'm not talking about a Christ or the Virgin or nobody making love. It's the demons making love. So I wanted to develop this topic and use it for my social housing project. So that's why we've got here some elements sticking to the facade, and we're here next to the library by Francais Perrault. So this was the library, which shows the abstraction of a public facility, but here I am in the sphere of the domestic social housing. So again, here the structure is this kind of pillars, and the layout is just a plateau with a central circulation, and you're going to, well, to put the layout that you want inside. I mean, 2-3 bedroom fitted houses, and well, whatever you want. Here we've got this aesthetic element, but this kind of glazing and window will allow you to ventilate the building, and you will never need heating in the winter. And this is just because of the positioning of the facade. And if the population changes in the neighborhood, I mean, if more students are coming and they want smaller apartments, or if big families come and they want bigger apartments, I mean, you can modify the layout of the building, of the inside of the flats. So this gives the possibility for this building to become a great tool, because the workmaster will be able to provide the kind of housing that is requested. And next to that comes another building called Les Frigos. This is a building made up of unpolished facades. In Paris, all the offices are double glazed, and actually, well, they have big windows, but of course, you can always see what's inside, and you can see boxes, you can see cables, you can see, well, all the inside, and sometimes it's not nice. So we worked in a system of facade which provides unpolished elements, so you're not removing the light, so you're not preventing the light from coming in, but you will not see from the outside what's going on inside. And then there's this factor, it's the daylight. So we have a way to calculate the amount of light that is provided in Paris workplaces. And again, it's unpolished. And we see that this amount of light works in a way, it's just as if it was a kind of canopy of light, actually. So there's even more light than what was foreseen. And these are some uncentered elements. These are the little entrances for the firemen. And this is the building called Les Frigos. And another project, the Ministry of Culture. This is the National Conference Center. We used to have a building that was closed. 4 sides were closed, and this was a building made in 3 different phases from 1945 to 1980. And then came an international tender, and I got it. And the idea was to bring some light to the yard, to the patio, and to distribute the light. And by distributing the different surfaces, you're distributing the light. So here we have this building, and we have plastered all the building to provide more width and thickness. And here, since this building is from the past, from 3 different periods of time in the past, we have provided this kind of layer to the facade so that you can see a uniform facade and you don't see the difference between the 1940s, 50s, and so on and so forth. So this is a kind of second skin, and it's some kind of inspiration also from the previous paint by Romain. So you can see natural light getting in. This is at 11 o'clock in the morning, no electric light. So it works very well. It's just natural light. And this is another topic that we have explored, bridges. Well, I was a candidate for the tender for the bridge of Millau. Finally, the tender was given to Normand Foster. Never mind. But anyway, this is just to tell you that I'm very much interested in bridges. We were also requested to go to a city next of Florence in Italy to build a bridge on the Arno River. And this is what we get. This is a very simple bridge. It's 1.2 kilometers long, and it just crosses the river through this meander. So it allows you to come from one end to the river to the other. And what's interesting actually is that in the upper profile, I was challenging anybody to make a bridge that would involve less matter than this, and it was not possible. So again, this is a project that would save matter, actually. So it's the economy of matter. This is what we are trying to do today. We're trying to save and to spare the use of concrete and other kinds of matter. So it's the spirit of frugality. So, of course, we want to pay attention to all details, because if you don't pay attention to details, you cannot master architecture. With no detail, there's no architecture. Another project, also within the same system. This is another bridge, but this is called La Ligne 13 in Orly. And we developed this with Rudy and Romain Ricciti, engineers. And in this case, we're using performing concrete. And this is a kind of concrete that allows to have fibers inside instead of steel. So it brings some kind of flexibility to this matter. And it allows the bridge to be less thick. And this is an intradose of 2 meters wide, so that 2 tramways can circulate. And in a bridge with this, which is only 40 centimeters thick. And this is the result of calculations by the engineers. And so this is what we get. But there was a struggle between those who wanted to make this railway system underground and those who wanted to make it upper ground. And well, of course, it changes the cost of it. And we said that we would work with this high performance concrete that would allow us to have quite a lot of matter, but much less matter than with normal concrete. So the project that got the tender is a project like this, and then 6 months later they called our engineers to execute the project. This is the misery of architecture. And going back to housing again, These are some flats that we developed in Batignolles. And this is a bit more classical. It's in the Martin Luther King Park. That was made by Anzo Piano for the Ministry of Justice. And we're developing here a series of works where the facade is important again. Sometimes we use serigraphy, sometimes we don't. And there are this kind of ramps that will protect. Here we have tested serigraphy in this kind of tin layers, tin blades. It's and the result is a kind of tattooed building actually, and we wanted to make this kind of massive tattoo in the building. And this is the last project I will present. This is a project for the mail company near Montparnasse in Paris. And here I'm talking about another topic. It's a renovation of some facilities that will be transformed to become social housing and private housing. Here I'm talking about a neighborhood in Paris. It's next to Montparnasse, and it was very complicated because we started renovating the building like architects do, and they try to do things and they try to add insulation and add windows and so on. So they just try to restructure. And what we wanted, what we wanted to do was the same that we did for the Ministry of Culture, as I showed you before, the Bons Enfants. But actually, this time we wanted to use the same system for social housing. Anyway, well, we could, in the end, achieve some buildings with lots of windows and lots of light. But of course, we have facades here in stainless steel, and in Paris, Paris is a city of stone. And when we were proposing to use stainless steel, they said, "You're crazy." But anyway, architecture is a combat sport, so we kept fighting for this. And well, again, we're using the old structure of the building, but we're giving to the building this new second skin with the stainless steel. It still may become rusted, but in this case, we're using stainless steel, so it will not rust. You cannot use normal steel for the outside. So these are the flats. Again, social housing and private housing, both of them. This is the result of a small operation, but we had to work many different details. Actually, architecture here is given by the plan. The planning and the layout, I mean, we see the space and we are building inside. I mean, it's not like inventing a new shape like I did for the electricity company. In this case, we are pre-directed by a previous layout. It's another kind of exercise. But what's interesting in architecture is that you're always confronted with different kinds of exercises. And this is a kind of panel that we use. It's called GKD. It's this kind of metal grid that we use. And here we have elements for thermal comfort. And so as I'm saying, for me, architecture is first and foremost a housing issue. And this is my commitment. So in 2017, housing was regulated based on a series of regulations, of legislations. And then with Macron, these regulations for housing were modified. And the intention was to make it better. the political intention. So I organized a group, the Initiative for Housing, and many people participated: promoters, designers, architects, landscape experts, notaries, intellectual people, writers. And we proposed something new regarding housing. But of course, politicians, they never listen to anybody. And of course, let alone architects. So this new piece of legislation favors businesses, it favors companies. So in the past, we would, whenever there was a new project for housing, you would call an architect and you would see a plot of land, and then you would work on this. And this new piece of legislation is saying that architects do never respect prices or deadlines. So we're going to try to find companies, and we're going to set a certain budget for companies and ask them to tell what they can do with that budget. So then companies will try to seek architects, and certain architects, they're very cool and they don't like to think, and then they will just abide by what the company is saying. And if the company is saying this is too costly, no insulation, no kitchen, it's too costly, and then you will find very poor equipped social housing. So that's why there's this initiative. And of course, we were never chosen because the idea, the strategy was to prefer businesses. And this was just because of a matter of costs. But never, it was never for the sake of people and for the inhabitants. So, well, we kept working. So this is the housing initiative. There was a huge work that was being done, and we never gave up in spite of being rejected. And we even organized another group with more architects and with people who were also working for the state. And actually, during COVID, somebody asked, well, what did you learn from lockdown? Well, not much, because I think that housing has not progressed. I mean, we always pretended, we always said we wanted more outside space, but nothing has changed, actually. Nothing has progressed. No progress has been made. So recently, and this is quite recent, actually, we have organized ourselves in a different way. And not so long ago, we were received by the Minister of Housing, and now we're going to try to use projects instead of seeking companies. So we're now in a kind of conflict of interest, because if you don't try to knock at the door of the top people to send your projects, it's very difficult. I don't know what the situation is here in Spain, but in France, it's very difficult to do social housing because it's all in the hands of companies and not architects. So what is the space? I mean, the city is made, well, 80% of it is just residences and housing and offices. So, well, it's true that there's 20% of facilities like the electricity company and so on, but what about 80% of this architecture that is put in the hands of companies and not architects? So it's all the problem that we have today. What should we do to regain the power? Architects, landscape experts, philosophers, so that we can provide social housing. So, well, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much. And of course, if you do have questions. This is a very difficult question because this is a question actually that is not in the hands of the architect alone. It depends very much on politicians as well, on the mayors of cities. In France, maybe different from China. In France, you will build social housing for people who do not have the means, and as you're saying, in China, it's the same. But then, of course, the difficulty is to make people gather from different ethnic groups. And yeah, this is your question. It's a very complicated issue. You know, I come from the surroundings of Paris. It's a neighborhood called Sarcelles. Everything was built in the 70s, and I lived there for 20 years in a space where, I mean, all the communities were blended. They were mixed. There were Chinese people and then the Arab people and black people and everything. We were all living there. We were all united in a certain value that was about living together and coexisting together. And I stayed there for 20 years. But the problem is that, you know, we're seeing this with riots. I guess that you've all seen all the riots, for instance, taking place in Paris. And we do have a problem with that, with the difficulty of integrating different ethnic groups of people who do not want to be integrated. So, you know, if you're having people in a building who do not want to be integrated, then the building is screwed. And let me, well, forgive my language. And it's not the architect's fault. I mean, the architect is going to provide to all these people from different backgrounds a surface, a facade, and the total freedom for that space. But you're Chinese, and you're going to inhabit that space in a different way than I will, because I'm French. So the important thing for the architect is, you know, we're not going to, of course, it's not because we have people from Algeria that we're going to have a kashba. The idea is to have open spaces for different purposes so that everybody can fit in there and build their own life. But I know it's complicated. It's more than architecture. It's also the political level. And you know, you always have to build at the lowest cost. And you have to give the people the impression that they're rich. And this is a very interesting piece of work for architects. This is quite a challenge, and this is what should be taught in schools of architecture. I mean, how to give people the impression that they are rich. I think this is a matter of respect. Well, there are many issues here. Well, today you may use one matter. It can be concrete, it can be steel or glass. It's always a choice. And well, architects, we have preferences. We have a choice of different materials, and we have a very wide choice. So depending on the kind of program or the kind of site or the location or the context. You know, if you're in a rural area or in an urban area, or if you're in Beijing or in Barcelona, you're going to build in a different way. So architects have to remain available. We need to have this kind of wide range of knowledge so that every time that we have something to do, well, we will reflect. We will reflect on the environment. We will reflect on the social context, on the space. I mean, there's so many parameters in architecture. I would say that it is the most synthetic field or discipline in the world. And actually, you know, I'm not going to become a kind of Richard Meyer who's always going to use white tiles regardless on the place where he's working. I think that you have to adapt. And then, but then the problem with the public, it's very complicated. But let me be very clear. If you're asking people what they want, you will never do architecture. You will do some Walt Disney. However, you can propose things to people that they're not able to think about. But then you need to nail it. Because if you propose things that belong to their scope, well, they will adopt it and they will say, oh, I had never thought of this before, but it's cool, it's a good idea. When I was using this glass with serigraphy, you know, it was 20 years ago, they blamed me for being communist, anarchist, terrorist. But you know, right now, a survey has been carried out and nobody wanted those glass panels with serigraphies, let me tell you. But, you know, now there's been this survey and, you know, some students were knocking at the door and they were saying to the people in the house, they said, oh, we're going to change this tainted serigraphy glasses and we're going to change it with transparent glasses. And nobody wanted that change because they had made that change, they had integrated that change. So again, if you do not propose things that are different to what people want, for starters, you will never do architecture. Because they will tell you, I want stone, I want wood, I want this, I want that. And it can be okay. I mean, if there's people who know what they want, it's okay. But most people haven't got a clue about what they want. Or maybe they don't have the right information. They see television or I'm not saying that they're stupid, but I'm just saying that they're not cultivated or educated in that discipline. And that's it. I mean, you are educated, you are students in schools of architecture, but they are not. So you can discuss with them and it's okay, but to a certain point, because otherwise you fall into demagogy. And you know, there's no architect that can play as a demagogue as well. I don't know if this answers your question. Any other question? Yeah, Miguel? Thank you. Thank you very much for your conference. You talked about the difficulty of social housing, executing social housing. So have you thought about the possibility to recycle these buildings from the 70s? Is this a possibility to offer to society so that there can be some social housing? I mean, even though you cannot do that social housing the way you want, well, now we cannot do this. What we want is to offer, first of all, platforms that will be able to evolve, because in the city, I mean, we should not be demolishing anymore for ecological reasons. I mean, transforming is much better than destroying or demolishing. You know, in the 70s, we used to demolish to rebuild. And today, for ecological reasons, you cannot do that. So today, it's not good. So we keep the buildings. But in order to keep a building, there are two methods. For once, I mean, you can use what exists, what remains. And the second thing is to build new buildings, so new houses. But then you have to design buildings that will be flexible, that will be reversible, so that the city can change without having to change every project in a permanent way. And this is actually a topic, reversibility. And there are books on that. There are books made out of research, and there's this author who wrote a book, and she says that actually this is an economic issue and an ecologic issue, but also a tax related issue. Because when you transform a building into a housing building, you are paying less tax. Sorry, so the city is not gaining as much tax. So today, if you're building houses, you need to be aware that, well, these houses, maybe in 10 or 15 years, they will become something else. So we have to build with that perspective. Less matter, more flexibility, more openings, more passage to different areas. So I think it's important. And this works also for public buildings. For example, there's this building from Rodez, which is a very specific building. And then there's Beaubourg. It's the other way around. Georges Pompidou, it's different panels and you can change everything you want. So sometimes you can be very specific or very wide. And housing, well, you have to be very wide because, in the past there was, the buildings were not flexible at all. And now this is not possible anymore. We need to change the way we build. But companies do not want to do that. They just want the lowest cost, and then they are using technologies which are a constraint, which are not ecological. And I know it's a little bit contradictory. I wonder if I answered your question. Yes, you did. Okay, well, thank you very much. Come on, young people, you can speak out loud. Now there's a young person. I can see a French young man. I don't know if I'm young enough, but I'm going to take the floor. I just wanted to say that as a first conference for this workshop, well, I think that from a pedagogical point of view, everything you said was fantastic, and I wanted rather to thank you rather than asking a question. I would also like to give my reflection. There's always this attitude of the architect who's a little bit like a combatant or a fighter, because the architect takes responsibility. But this fight cannot be individual. And you explained very well that for social housing, 3 different architects can work together and have a common understanding and, and do something good. Even things that are not foreseen and abiding by the regulations of a certain tender. I mean, it is possible. And this is very good news for the fatality of this written architecture, which seems to be the result of what should not be expected from us. But this is somehow what the system is provoking. So it's this kind of resignation that happens. So I think that this energy that you conveyed is something fantastic. And I think that this should be fostering the way we execute our works. And I also appreciated very much the way in which your works can overcome often simplistic oppositions between a constructive architecture and an artistic architecture. And again, we're talking about this merger between art and architecture. And sometimes some ancestral aspects can become so contemporary. And you were merging the architectural culture and the artistic culture, and you were able to propose recent elements, contemporary elements, and also adding the use of this, and again the use of these works. And actually, you can always keep working on this and keep proposing, stimulating works. Thank you. Yes, if I may answer, there's the architects know how to do this, and then there's also art and technique which go together. An artist cannot build if there's no technique in his masterpiece. I mean, and the same goes, for instance, for a photographer. I mean, he cannot take photographies if he cannot frame or something. So it's art and technique. And today we have a certain knowledge, and we have abstract research, and sometimes researchers are not constructive. At least, I don't know, in France, I don't know, in Spain or in China, but in France, sometimes architects, they are rejected because they learn no technique. Because, when you're undertaking a project, there's the concept part and then there's the execution. So first of all, you're going to draw a concept, and then you have to be supported by the company who will build up. And the problem is that in schools of architecture, you tend to learn about the first part only and not the second part. And sometimes in our own office, when you get students from schools of architecture here in France, I don't know in other places, but they do not know how to lay a brick upon another one. So you cannot work. I mean, you cannot send these architects to work with the company because they have no idea of technique. I mean, we're not a technical school. We're at the School of Architecture to dream, to reflect. Of course, we can do that, and we have to do that. But at the same time, we must be able to know how to build. And right in the middle of these two parts, there's the use. The use, because there's the people who will use this. I mean, it's not abstract art, it's art that will be put at the service of certain people. I mean, there's going to be people living inside our buildings, aren't they? So sometimes it's difficult to satisfy everybody, but we need to find the kind of balance that will allow you to be good for everybody. And then of course you can set your own margins, and this is what's difficult today. And I think that sometimes young people, they do not react enough to the technique. I mean, schools of architecture in France, they train researchers who are just in the field of research, of abstract research, and it's not even artistic, and they're talking about things, but they don't even know what they're talking. If you go to the biennial in Venice, and you'll see what's going on. There's no proposals that are being produced. We are lacking propositions. So it's your task here, actually. Dare, propose, insist. Because anyway, they're going to be giving up and not you. But if you don't insist, you will never get it. Yeah. No question. Yeah, I think it's the last one. So my question is, what do you think about social housing that was made in the 60s and crime and the relationship with architecture, and how did you think that the idea of serigraphy came up to you? This original idea of using serigraphy in the building. And okay, I think I understand the question, and I'm going to answer very quickly. Architecture cannot interfere in social problems, and it will never solve social problems. Social problems or problems, at short, will be solved by education, work, but not by architecture. Architecture, you know, again, I'm going to give you the example. I used to live in social housing in Sarcelles for 20 years, and every single day I would see very wealthy buildings, and but it was the same kind of buildings that we had in our neighborhood. And in one neighborhood, in the rich neighborhood, they were spotless, and in our neighborhood, they were not. And I'm talking about the same buildings. In other words, I'm talking about architecture not being able to solve social problems. I mean, if you think that an architect can solve this kind of problems, no, it does not work this way. Architecture is not there for that. Of course, we can improve certain things. We can provide things, and this is what I was trying to say. We always try as architects to give as much as possible in order to upgrade the building. You know, you're working with a certain cost constraint, but you will always try to upgrade and to bring the most you can. So you may solve 1% of the problem, which is already enormous. But you know, the architect has to understand that he has a social role to play. Otherwise, we will not exist here in 20 years. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. So this is the